Welcome to Hobbs House Bakery. I'm Jane and I teach bakery classes here at the Cookery School. This year we're celebrating 100 years of baking, and as part of our celebration we want to share with you a recipe for a heritage sourdough loaf with toasted sunflower seeds. So I've got 400 grams of the white heritage flour here and 100 grams of the whole grain. I like to weigh my water and my sourdough starter in the same bowl and then add it to my flours. We're going to do a 30-minute auto-lees, and so to allow that the grain to absorb some of that moisture, and then I'm going to add 10 grams of salt after 30 minutes. So I've got 100 grams, and this is our dark rye starter. And then into that, I'm just going to check the temperature of my water. So my water's just under 40 degrees. And so I'm going to add 340 grams of water. So we weigh our water, it's much more accurate. Just with my dough scraper, I've got my water and my sourdough starter, and I'm just going to chop that up a little bit. Particularly with a no-knead recipe, I like to mix the sourdough starter. So then, again, doesn't really matter. I always think less washing up because I'm going to put the dry into the wet. And then again, just using my dough scraper, I'm going to just stir that all together. All the dry bits have gone. It's quite a sort of shaggy looking dough, not smooth at all. But we're just going to leave that covered again in a warm place for 30 minutes and come back to it to add the salt. So our dough's had its 30 minutes auto-lees, and so I'm going to add the salt now. Sprinkle that on the top. I'm going to just wet my hand a little bit so the dough doesn't stick, and then just using a claw I'm going to just squeeze we can see how extensible the dough has got just by the 30 minutes. So just by adding water to the flour, you start to activate the gluten. But what we need to do now by adding the folds is to put strength into our dough. And so then I've got my dough scraper, so I'm just going to scrape down the sides. I'm going to give it just a little fold just to make it a little bit neater, and I'm going to do that in the bowl. So I'm just going to gently stretch the dough, turn it over, and try not to tear the dough. It's quite a gentle action, and then about sort of 4 or 5 times, and then once it's tightened up we can just flip it over just in my hand and tuck it in. And then again, if you've got any dough stuck on the side, just give that a good scrape down with your dough scraper. So again, I'm going to cover that. It's going to have three folds at 30-minute intervals, and then after that it will have its bulk fermentation for about another hour and a half. So our dough's had its first 30 minutes of its bulk fermentation, so I'm going to do the first stretch and fold. Just a little bit of water on the table, you want a sort of circular bit, a little bit larger than the surface of the dough, and then I'm going to just get my dough scraper in there, scoop out the dough onto the table, and leave nothing behind. So then I'm just going to lightly shape it into a rough rectangle, and then again, so if you think the dough is going to stick to your hands, you might need to use the dough scraper just to help you. So you don't really want the dough sticking to the table. And then I'm going to fold and then one side and then the other. And then what I'm going to do is just flip it over, and then using my dough scraper, just get it into, it sticks a little bit, don't worry, just get a bit more water on your scraper, and then just scoop it around a couple of times, try and get some tension on it. And then we're going to pop it back into the bowl. So again, so if you think it might stick, just get a little bit of water on your hands and your dough scraper, and then just quite quickly, just scoop it up, pop it in the bowl. And then I might just get my dough scraper, just the short end, and then just tuck any loose bits in. And so there it is, sitting in the bottom of the bowl. So I'm going to rest that for another half an hour, and then I'm going to add the sunflower seeds to it, which I've got here already toasted. This is 50 grams of sunflower seeds that I've just toasted in the oven and for about 4 or 5 minutes, and just allow them to cool down before you add them to your dough. So we've now got our second stretch and fold, so of 3, and we're going to add our sunflower seeds at this point. So a bit of water on the table, not too much, and then scrape your dough out onto the table. And then we're going to add the sunflower seeds. It is going to be quite sticky at this point, so just a bit of water on your hands, maybe a bit on your dough scraper. Flip it over. So, and just by adding the sunflower seeds in the folds, we'll just mix them in. So, because we're going to do another fold, and that will just make sure that they're entirely mixed in. So, flip over your dough, gather it up as much as you can. And then, oops, you can see that the sunflower seeds some of them have come to the surface, and they're just under the tension that's been created on the top of the dough. So I'm just going to use my metal scraper to get it back in the bowl. So once you're happy with the shape, give it a good scoop underneath, and then, oops, just drop it back in. And just going to give that another 30 minutes before I give it another stretch and fold. Our dough has had it's had about 3.5 hours of its bulk ferment, so with the 3 folds. So it's increased in volume by about 50%, and I've got some fermentation activity I can see on the surface of the dough. We're going to do a pre-shape and then let it rest again, and before we pop it into a tin. So I've got my tin, it's the larger size that we do, so it's for a kilo loaf. Because it's relatively new as well, I've given it a wipe out, but then I've also just lightly oiled it and popped a strip of paper in it, and that's just to help it stop any sticking that might happen. So again, I'm just going to get a little bit of water and then just pop that on the table, scoop out my dough, and then, as before, just going to give it its shape. So a bit of water on my hands, got my dough scraper here just in case I need it. So then I'm just going to fold one side over and the other. And then scoop the bottom. So you want to try to avoid it sticking to the table if you can. And then I'm just going to, oops, let's use this one, I think. Just going to flip it over. So then what we're trying to do is get a little bit of tension onto our dough. And get some tension on your dough, and then see it's getting less sticky. So, and it should sit up quite nicely like that. So I'm going to leave that to rest, because what I don't want to do is then shape it again and risk tearing the gluten structure. So I'm just going to let that rest. And the easiest thing to do is just pop your bowl over the top, like so, just to stop it from forming any skin. And then we'll come back to it in about 20 minutes. Okay, so should we have a look at what's under the bowl? So, great, that's looking good. So it's had its pre-shape, and so now we're going to get it ready to go in the tin. So I'm just going to sprinkle the top with a little bit of flour, and you may have noticed that I haven't been using flour when I've been doing when I've been getting the bowl dough out onto the table from the bowl. And really that's so that you don't add too much raw flour to your dough. But for the final stages of shaping, I'm just going to use a little bit of flour. So just with my dough scraper, just going to scoot some of that flour that's on the table underneath and then just flip it over. So then just going to tease it out into a bit of a rectangle shape. And then I'm going to look at my tin. So this is going to be the length of my dough. So I'm going to fold it and roll it in a second. So I want to just make sure that it's no wider than the length of my tin. So I'm going to lift one side into the center. So I've got a nice square side there. I'm going to do the same on the other side. If you think it might be sticking, just stretch it out into the center and then just pat it down lightly. And then I've got, so the two sides are folded over. So then at the top, these two corners, I'm just going to lightly fold those in. Just all the time being quite gentle. And then I'm going to just, the tips of my fingers, just roll that bit towards me. And then just pick it up, the tips of my fingers, and then with my thumb, stretching it away from me until, and then with your dough scraper, it's got a bit close to the edge of the table, I can then continue shaping it a little bit more, because I want an oblong to go into my tin. So I'm just going to press it from either side. So if this was going to go into a banneton, I'd then want to flip it up the other way, so that's the seam side uppermost. But because it's going into the tin, I've got my seam side underneath. So I'm going to just double check it's not too big. If it is too big, you can just scoot those ends in. Just sprinkle the top again with a bit more flour. So then just pick it up and then pop it in the tin. So it's sitting just nicely in the bottom. So again, we're going to cover that with the same bag that I was using before. So you could leave it in the fridge overnight. We're going to leave it out and bake it the same day. So I'm just going to leave it again somewhere nice and warm and let that ferment. So now it's time for baking. Our loaf is doubled in size in the tin. So all I'm going to do is sprinkle a bit extra flour on the top, and then I'm not going to score this. I'm just going to let it have a natural burst, and we'll just see what happens. I've got my oven set at 230, and I've also preheated the steam channel. So I'm going to pop some water in the steam channel, put my bread in, and then we'll bake that for about 30 minutes. We'll have a look after 30 and see what it looks like. In with the bread. I'm going to pop it on the top shelf, just in the centre. The steam is present just to help give our loaf that jump, that spring. So because what we don't want is the loaf to colour too early, so that it prevents it from springing to its maximum. So our bread's had about 15 minutes, so I'm just going to open the steam vents and let any excess steam out. So our dough's had about 30 minutes, so let's go and have a look, see if it's ready. So I can see that it's shrunk away from the side, so that's a good sign that it's ready. I can see that it's nice and coloured. It's got a nice even colour all the way around. Let's give it a tap on the bottom, sounding nice and hollow. That's nice looking little loaf. But so we'll leave that to cool down. So we don't want to cut it straight away to see what it looks like inside. We just want to give it an hour or so to cool down before we dig in.